Module 2, Constitutional Structure and Philosophy. Weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, an agreement entered into by the former colonies that had declared independence from Great Britain, went into effect in 1781, after all 13 states ratified the agreement. Under the Articles of Confederation, the states established a confederacy, a union of independent sovereign states with a central common government for limited purposes. This confederacy, to be known as the United States of America, was entered into by the states as a firm league of friendship with each other for their common defense, the security of their liberties, and their mutual and general welfare, binding themselves to assist each other against all force offered to or attacks made upon them. The central or national government set up under the Articles was designed to keep most of the powers of governance in the hands of the state legislatures. The states would retain their sovereignty, as well as all powers not specifically delegated to the national government. These states had only recently been colonies of an empire with what they perceived to be a despotic king and an all-powerful central parliament across the Atlantic Ocean. Furthermore, these states had each acted largely independently of each other while still colonies, and saw their state identity rather than a national identity as Americans as their paramount allegiance. As such, they feared that a central government with too much power and a strong chief executive would replicate the abuses of the British Empire and the British monarch, and they set up the national government with these fears in mind. Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government had no president and no national courts. The national legislature consisted of one House of Representatives, in which each state had one vote, regardless of the population of the state. To pass a law required a supermajority of 9 out of the 13 states voting in favor, and any amendment to the Articles had to be agreed to by all the states. Most governing authority remained in the hands of the state legislatures. The national legislature had the power to maintain an army and a navy. However, since it did not have the power to levy or collect taxes, it was dependent on the states for funding. Crucially, the legislature also lacked the power to regulate interstate and foreign commerce. While these limiting features of the national government were deliberate, the weakness of this governing arrangement soon became evident. The Revolutionary War had left the nation with a substantial war debt owed to foreign powers. Without the ability to tax, the national legislature resorted to requesting funds from the state governments to pay down the national debt. However, the states who had war debts of their own were not forthcoming. A government that did not pay off its debts could not establish strong international credit, making it more difficult for the national government to raise funds needed for governance. Furthermore, the denial to the national government of the right to regulate interstate and foreign commerce had damaging economic effects. With the national government unable to regulate commerce with foreign nations, each state conducted its own trade policy with other countries, which could be at odds with the position of the national government. As a result, the United States could not present a unified trade policy when dealing with other nations, and so lacked the leverage needed to negotiate commercial agreements with foreign governments. Likewise, the government was unable to enact national measures to protect American industries from foreign competitors. These competitors took advantage of the lack of uniformity to seek trade with the states offering the friendliest trade policy. The states themselves engaged in trade wars with each other, imposing duties on goods from other states, and taking other retaliatory measures, driven by local competition and trade relations with foreign powers. The impotence of the national government came to the fore in 1786, when groups composed largely of farmers from western Massachusetts began widespread protests, demanding that the state address the crushing tax and commercial debt burdens faced by the farmers. These groups were led by Daniel Shays, a captain in the Continental Army, and included many veterans from the Army who had not received pay owed to them for their service because the national government could not raise the necessary funds. Feeling that their petitions had been repeatedly ignored, the groups attacked state courthouses and tried to storm the Federal Armory in Springfield, Massachusetts. While this Shays Rebellion was eventually put down by a private militia raised by Massachusetts, these events only highlighted the incapacity of the weak national government to respond to national crises or administer a national system of governance. The Constitutional Convention, Constitutional Structure. Representatives of the states met in Philadelphia in May 1787 to attempt to address these weaknesses. The representatives had been invited to a convention to revise the system of governance under the Articles of Confederation to enable the central government to better address economic issues and, in the aftermath of the Shays' Rebellion, to strengthen the capability of the national government. The Congress of the Confederation endorsed the Convention of Delegates in Philadelphia for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. However, among the organizers of the convention were men like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, who wanted to move beyond the Articles of Confederation entirely and envisioned the creation of a completely new government. As the convention progressed, the purpose of the convention shifted from amending the Articles to replacing them. The delegates worked to devise a constitution that would establish a new nation with a strong national government framework for the states. The new national government would be a federal system in which the overarching national government would be responsible for national governance and would be supreme over state governments, while individual state governments would govern issues internal to the states. It was hoped that centralizing power in the national federal government would address the governing weaknesses faced by the central government under the Articles of Confederation. However, concern for centralized power was still very much on the minds of the framers of the Constitution, and the new governing framework was also designed to limit the power of the federal government. The federal government itself would consist of three branches: the executive branch, the judicial branch, and the legislative branch. By design, each branch would operate independently of the others and be responsible for distinct governmental functions. This arrangement was based on the principle of separation of powers, under which no single governing power would be responsible for all governing functions, reducing the chance that any single branch would grow too powerful. At the same time, the framers instituted ways for each branch to limit the operations of the branches, an idea known as checks and balances. In an important departure from the Articles of Confederation, the federal government would have a single chief executive known as the President. The President was to be selected by an electoral college, a group of state representatives apportioned according to each state's population and chosen by the state, who would vote to elect a president. A president would be elected by securing an absolute majority of votes in the electoral college. The president would be responsible to execute the laws of the new nation that were passed by the legislative branch. The president was granted broad powers such as serving as commander-in-chief and the ability to check the legislature through a presidential veto of laws passed by the legislature. At the same time, the legislature was charged with declaring war, could override a presidential veto of legislation, and could remove a president for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Article 2, Section 4. Establishing the legislative branch involved a number of compromises. One concerned the matter of representation. Madison proposed what was known as the Virginia Plan, under which each state would be apportioned representation in the legislature on the basis of population. The smaller states, who had benefited from the one-state, one-vote structure of the Articles of Confederation, backed the New Jersey Plan, which retained the equal representation position for each state in the legislature. A compromise solution was adopted by the convention. There would be a bicameral legislature with two representative bodies. The House of Representatives would consist of representatives chosen by the people themselves in accord with the principles of popular sovereignty. Representation in the House of Representatives would be based on population as proposed in the Virginia Plan. However, to secure the agreement of the smaller states, a second legislative body, known as the Senate, would operate with an equal number of representatives from each state, who would be chosen by each state legislature. Passing legislation would require majority votes in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. Grants of power to the federal government. While the new government envisioned in the Constitutional Convention was to be stronger and more centralized than the national government under the Articles of Confederation, the concerns over centralized power were still very much alive in the minds of the framers. Instituting more effective central government while limiting the scope of the reach of the central government required a balance between the powers of the central government and those of the states. One key concept that the framers embedded into the Constitution to effect this balance is the idea of enumerated powers. Under this doctrine, The federal government created by the Constitution would not have the authority to exercise governance over the full range of powers that a legitimate government generally exercises over the people it governs. Instead, the Constitution only grants specific powers that are spelled out, or enumerated, in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8 lists the powers delegated to the federal government, including the power to tax, regulate commerce, coin money, protect intellectual property, raise armies, and declare war, among others. However, only these specifically delegated powers were granted to the federal government. All other legitimate powers of government not specifically granted to the federal government were, under the reserved powers doctrine of 10th Amendment to the Constitution, to be reserved to the states respectively or to the people. The Commerce Clause. To address the trade weaknesses manifested by the national government, the framers explicitly granted Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. By granting the federal government the sole power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, the new government would have the power to negotiate trade agreements with other nations free of complicating state trade agreements. Furthermore, Congress could regulate commerce between the states, removing barriers to trade among the states such as state taxes on out-of-state goods, creating a zone of free trade in which goods could be traded between states without being subjected to tariffs. The Necessary and Proper Clause. Like the Commerce Clause, most of the powers granted to the United States government were specific in nature. However, the final clause of Article 1, Section 8 granted the federal government the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all the other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States, or in any department or officer thereof. This Necessary and Proper Clause was a general grant of the authority for Congress to ensure that the federal government could implement and enforce those powers which were delegated to the authority of the federal government. Despite the limitations imposed on the federal government by the doctrine of enumerated powers, this clause provided room for the federal government to act in ways not expressly stated in the Constitution if the government action was in furtherance of the execution of enumerated powers. The scope of the Necessary and Proper Clause was put to the test when Congress established the Second National Bank of the United States in 1816. The National Bank served to hold deposits of the federal government and issue public debt. Some argued that Congress lacked the power to create a national bank under the Constitution, and states did not want the national bank operating in their state in competition with state banks. Maryland imposed a tax on the national bank, and the matter was settled in a landmark Supreme Court case, McCulloch v. Maryland. There were two questions before the court. 1. Did the federal government have the authority to charter a bank? And 2. Was such a bank subject to state taxes? The Supreme Court ruled that although the right to establish a bank is not one of the enumerated powers delegated to the federal government, the establishment of a national bank was constitutional. The court reasoned that as the federal government was given the power to tax, to raise armies, and declare war, the government must have the means to carry out these powers. Establishing a national bank was one important way the government could ensure that it had the capacity to carry out its enumerated powers. To justify this argument, the court interpreted the Necessary and Proper Clause very broadly. Under the Supreme Court's decision in McCulloch v. Maryland, the Necessary and Proper Clause means that the federal government can take all means which are appropriate and consistent with the letter and spirit of the Constitution to carry out its governing functions, if the goals it seeks to achieve are within the scope of the constitutional powers granted to the federal government. Since establishing the national bank was a means to carry out powers delegated to the federal government, the establishment of the bank was constitutional. The court also held that Maryland did not have the right to tax the national bank. The basis for this ruling was the Supremacy Clause in Article 6 of the Constitution, which established that the Constitution and the laws enacted by the federal government were the supreme law of the land and took precedence over state laws. The Maryland tax on the national bank was an attempt to assert the supremacy of state government over the federal government through state law and was therefore contrary to the Supremacy Clause. McCulloch v. Maryland established important precedent regarding the Necessary and Proper Clause and the Supremacy Clause. The federal government used the broad interpretations of these clauses, together with the power of the federal government, to regulate interstate commerce, to enact wide-ranging federal law and policy. Full faith and credit. Under Article 4, Section 1 of the Constitution, each state must afford full faith and credit to the official acts, records, and judgments of other states. The purpose of this clause was preventing conflict among states with regard to legal decisions and licenses. If a state could decide not to honor a court ruling from another state, for example, parties receiving unfavorable rulings in one state could seek to relitigate the case in another state. So, compelling each state to enforce the judgments of the courts of other states established a reliability and consistency of legal decisions and actions across the states. The Federalist Papers. In September 1787, the text of the Constitution was sent to the states. Each state was to decide whether or not to ratify the Constitution, and in doing so, replace the government of the Articles of Confederation with the new system of governance provided for in the Constitution. A number of outspoken leaders known as the Anti-Federalists were petitioning against the ratification of the Constitution, arguing that the strong central government being proposed under the Constitution was a threat to liberty, and in the same manner as the former British rule over the colonies. Between October 1787, shortly after the Constitution was put before the states for ratification, and May 1788, a series of 85 articles appeared in leading newspapers arguing in favor of ratification. These articles were collected and published together in May 1788, eventually becoming known as the Federalist Papers. The articles were originally published under the pseudonym Publius. In fact, they were written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. They tried to defend the need for a strong central government for the United States to conduct foreign affairs. They also responded to the Anti-Federalists by asserting that the separation of powers and the balance of powers in the constitutional structure would prevent the federal government from growing too powerful. Madison also put forth a foundational idea about the Republican form of government that was represented by the Constitution. Based on his study of other governments that called themselves republics, Madison identified what he considered to be the core principles of a true republic. Madison explained that in a republic, the government should operate on the basis of the wishes and interests of all the people, rather than only the interest of a favored class of people. Also, the people serving in the government should be appointed either directly or indirectly based on the input of the people. This would prevent the government from becoming a tool of oppression in the hands of select individuals and ensure the best operation of a republican form of government.